there's a lot of economic precarity out there right now. And, these kind of reactionary cultures, however false the answers may be, at least as far as I'm concerned, they offer them a worldview and a set of answers for their own anxieties and precarities. And with the manosphere, what's, I guess, interesting is the way that men experience anxiety and precarity, or experience these kinds of hardships quite differently to women. If a guy loses his job, if anyone loses their job, it's awful, and it's really destabilizing. If a guy loses his job and he has certain kind of like masculine ideals that he's trying to aspire to, there's a sort of double pain there, because it's a sort of failure of him as a man. And when men fail to meet those ideals we just talked about, or their sort of identity in relation to those ideals is threatened in some way, then they feel a particular pain, and they can sort of lash out against, or just sort of lash out generally in that sense.
Marcus, welcome to the show.
It's nice to be back. And your listeners don't know that we had a first attempt at this, and the internet just kind of crapped out on us. So anyway, but here we are.
Here we are. So Marcus, you have done a paper. You've done a paper on blue pills, red pills, and manosphere, all that stuff.
Yeah. I've done a few at this stage. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. So, what made you? What made you interested in all this stuff?
Okay. What made me interested in the manosphere? Well, I mean, my broader research for some time now is, I guess, what I'm sort of trying to explain to people is what you could sort of say is men and masculinities online. So the way that, boys and men and sort of young men sort of build these communities online, so a lot of my earlier stuff was on video gaming communities, which, kind of like, dominated, or there's sort of a lot of boys and young men in those kind of spaces. And then, more recently, these kind of reactionary, anti-feminist kind of quote unquote manosphere spaces. So there's a lot of talk, around kind of men's practices online. And I've got to say, this is a phrase that I don't like that much, but I mean, it'll be familiar probably to people listening. The idea of toxic masculinity, or this
I don't
kind of
either.
toxic spaces. And I've been really interested in looking at those kinds of spaces, but not just assuming that they're toxic. I think toxic is a really reductive, kind of moralistic way of looking at, people's different views. I'm a progressive guy, but I'm very reluctant to, call a sort of conservative guy's views toxic just because they're different from me. I mean, I'm a bit of a relativist like that. But having said that, some of the stuff we are talking about, that some of these communities are kind of breeding grounds, for some pretty kind of, I guess, unhealthy or antisocial kinds of views as well. But yeah. So I've been researching men and how they express their masculinity and so on online for some time now, sort of beginning with video gaming communities and kind of geek cultures, and now increasingly looking at this kind of reactionary thing called the manosphere.
Yeah. Last time we spoke, you kind of led me into the video game culture. I've always wanted to be like geekier than I am. I don't know. Like I've kind of wanted to fit into that culture, like in high school. I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
know, for some reason. But you
Well,
said
I mean,
like,
it's interesting. It's interesting you say that, because I mean that, and there's a lot of not just my stuff, but there's a lot of research on this about how, like geek identities have become a very kind of gendered and raced thing. So when people think of like the typical geek, essentially they often think of, a sort of a geeky white heterosexual guy,
yeah,
maybe like a, sort of a geeky Asian heterosexual guy. But the problem is geek culture is much bigger than that. So you've got, plenty of girls and women in this space. You've got plenty of gay people and people from a whole range of different backgrounds. But, the people who kind of police the space are these kind of often kind of geeky hetero white guys who kind of almost sort of make themselves the kind of typical gamer or the typical geek. And then other people who want to get into the culture or who are in the culture kind of feel less like, the sort of the normal geek. And so, yeah, again, I'm kind of interested in that. And, without wanting to sound kind of melodramatic or whatever, the research that people like us do is hopefully try, oh God, I hate, I don't want to sound cliche, but hopefully make these cultures and online spaces more kind of inclusive,
Yeah.
not just to bring people in, but for the people who are already in these spaces, to make everyone sort of feel, you know, as legitimate a gamer as, say me, as sort of white guy or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, you do stereotypically think of a white guy, hetero white. Maybe that's subconsciously, but no. I'm just all
No,
right.
no, but that's it, So, I mean, these are all sort of socially determined things, and and some people, some people feel more welcome, some people feel less welcome. So, if we can kind of change that in any way, that's a good thing, I reckon.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Okay, so how would you describe the Manosphere, Marcus, and its fringes? You write about its varied expression. It's big, and that's why you are like hesitant to say it's toxic because there's a lot of diversity in it, but there
Yeah.
are yeah.
Yeah, no, there is absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and when you say the manosphere and its fringes, yeah, you're referring to how we kind of specifically articulated in one paper that we did on 4chan, which we can talk about later, where we very, deliberately said the manosphere and its fringes in the sense that it is a complex thing. It's not. I don't think it's as easily definable, and you can kind of draw boundaries around it in the way that a lot of people try to do. But I mean, it's okay. So in simplest terms, what is the manosphere? God, I've sort of written a version of this so many times at this point, but basically, it's a very, and this is important to say, it's a very loose, so it's not an organized thing really, but it's a very loose kind of online network of what you could call male centered. So predominantly sort of men, and predominantly also sort of, cis heterosexual men, um, who sort of come together or sort of seem to be emerging online, who kind of share reactionary and specifically kind of anti-feminist kind of views to kind of make sense of their lives and the world that they live in. And yeah, and the reason the fringes thing is important, because yeah, again, it's for me, well, not just for me, but for me, it's not a clear cut thing what's going on in there. I mean, it's sort of hard to kind of like say who's exactly in this thing called the manosphere and who's not in this thing called the manosphere. I was actually talking to someone the other day, and so, you've got to figure like Andrew Tate, really famous,
Ah,
very clearly reactionary, anti-feminist. Um, I think it's fair to say in a lot of his views, quite overtly misogynistic.
yep.
Women should be in the home, women should be sex objects, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's someone that very clearly fits into that. But then someone was asking me the other day, oh, what about Logan Paul? Is Logan Paul in the manosphere? And of course he's not, because he's not, well, I mean, it's a complex thing because in some ways he offers a kind of like a quite sort of cartoonish hyper masculinity as a sort of, as a kind of role model for boys and young men. But he doesn't sort of go out there, as far as I know, sort of like espousing the kind of misogynistic, kind of overtly anti-feminist stuff, as far as I know, at least, in the same way as the Andrew Tate sort of phenomenon. So, yeah, so I'm reluctant to kind of like even, I mean, this is a very academic thing, but these categories are very kind of fluid, and but I guess what you can say is there is this emerging sort of phenomenon of kind of boys and young men coming together, and at the very least, sort of striving towards these quite traditional, kind of, I guess, kind of non-progressive kind of ideals of masculinity.
Ah.
Um, and and I say that just in an impartial sense, that even before, whether you're a progressive or whatever. I mean, it's definitely there's a kind of backlash to kind of progressive society going on online, especially amongst kind of boys and young men. Oh, and then so as you said, it's a diverse place. So and there are all these kind of like little sub factions in this space. If you want to look at the kind of specific subcultures or whatever, and I think someone like Andrew Tate can be seen as part of what some people have referred to as the alpha pickup artists set.
Ah.
and so those kinds of communities are all kind of like coalesce around, how to be more successful at picking up chicks, and how to sort of, well, not even sort of form necessarily romantic sort of serious relationships, but basically, yeah, how can you sort of go out and be more successful with women? And then, again, you have these kind of like in between that, you have these kind of geek, kind of sci-fi fantasy cultures who kind of rail against kind of progressive shifts in the kind of media that they love, particularly when they see kind of like, female heroes where, you used to have Luke Skywalker, then you have, I can't remember her name, but, sort of like the female version of Luke Skywalker, and they get angry about that. And then there's also a race part to that. There's sort of like, oh, all this kind of like checkbox diversity in my favorite sort of science fiction film. And again, this is predominantly sort of men in these kind of geek cultures doing that. Then on the whole other side of it, you have what your listeners will probably be quite familiar with, or some will be, the incel subculture. And essentially uh, they're this sort of group of young men who have essentially kind of like completely failed, uh, as they see it in life, completely failed in their ability to sort of form intimate relationships, heterosexual relationships, I should say, and have essentially given up and have kind of grown this deep, deep hatred for women and deep, deep hatred for this kind of society that they see as being kind of sort of pitted against them. So in a sense, all of those weird kind of, and there's, there's more, I could go on forever in terms of all these different subcultures that people see as being part of this. But in a sense, one way of thinking about it is a kind of spectrum where on one hand, you have the kind of pickup artist set and their kind of like discourses of kind of success and how to be a real man. And then right at the other end, you have the kind of these abject failures like the incels who have just sort of given up. But what sort of brings them all together, yeah, is this sort of shared reactionary kind of anti-feminist position.
Yeah, that's wow. I love that. I love how you broke all of that down. Have you?
Sorry, it's a bit complicated.
No, you made it very clear.
No, thank you.
Through your research, the have you ever looked into why these guys are having such a reaction towards feminism? Is there any research on that, or?
Yeah, well, a lot of what I try to do is to try and kind of like, uh, you know, unpack the kind of motivations for why this phenomenon has emerged so kind of like strongly. There's kind of two forms of research on this space. One form of research is more concerned with what's coming out of the manosphere. So, those misogynistic discourses, how they work, kind of, trying to analyze and unpack, the kind of logics and so on. And then there's a kind of research that I do, which again is kind of more, is absolutely just mainly interested in what you're asking now, which is, what's kind of driving boys and young men into these spaces. That is a hugely complicated
Ah,
question, and it's essentially the same question as, what's driving more and more people towards kind of the right wing in a broader sense, whether it's got men or women, young people, and so on. And then obviously the election in America recently was that, which kind of surprised a whole bunch of people who maybe shouldn't have been surprised. But there's, you know, to give you in terms of thinking about the motivations of the manosphere and the appeal of kind of reactionary views and so on, there's a lot of economic precarity out there right now, and these kind of reactionary cultures, however false the answers may be, at least as far as I'm concerned, they offer them a worldview and a set of answers for their own anxieties and precarities. So, and with the manosphere, what's I guess interesting is the way that, because these are kind of sociological patterns. So I don't want to sort of say every individual is the same or whatever, but in a kind of generalizing sense or whatever, men experience anxiety and precarity, or experience these kinds of hardships quite differently to women. Um, so, like if a guy loses his job, if anyone loses their job, it's awful and it's really destabilizing. if a guy loses his job and he has certain kind of like masculine ideals that he's trying to aspire to, there's a sort of double pain there because it's a sort of failure of him as a man. And, you know, and again, I mean, there's lots of, you know, sort of related to that. There's a lot of quite sort of substantial studies at this point that show that uh, young men are much more likely to be isolated. They are much more likely to not be in intimate relationships or have a kind of sexually active life, you know, be basically isolated in a whole range of different ways. And so there's all these kinds of status markers that we inherit and we've had for decades or centuries or whatever, which say that, you know, a man's worth is his financial success, his ability to be attractive to women. We're talking about heterosexual guys, obviously, and a series of these markers. And we live in a society now where it is becoming increasingly difficult for a whole range of young men to achieve these markers.
Yes.
So that's when, you know, you get a figure like Andrew Tate comes in. And he offers this worldview that says progressive society is pit against us men. You know, the feminists have destroyed, you know, our ability to kind of like express ourselves as men. And then, you know, then he offers these kinds of, you know, false kind of strategies for kind of improving oneself or whatever. But it needs to be said, they, you know, that those cultures do offer some answers, and I'm not sure
They do.
you know, the kind of the left or the mainstream have kind of worked out a, you know, a good response to that. I mean, to give you on an anecdotal level, I'll tell you a story. A woman went out on a date recently with a guy, you know, sort of it was like a sort of dating app type thing or whatever. And you know, so you never know who you're going to get with those kinds of things when you actually meet them, right? And you know, and this guy at whatever it was, a dinner or whatever they were doing, you know, he started espousing some of this kind of Andrew Tate type stuff. You know, about, you know, men need to take charge or whatever it was, you know, just that kind of thing. And you know, and of course that the woman in question was completely turned off from this guy, you know what I mean? And like, oh my God, who is this kind of weirdo, right? And so it's, you know, on a very practical level, you know, you see how, you know, you get these guys drawn into this space, looking for answers, looking for meaning, looking to improve their lives. And then they get this kind of advice about kind of dating, which is just totally counterproductive. You know what I mean? Um, so yeah, they've been drawn in his space, and then, you know, and so it's not just, I mean, it's important to say that, you know, the kinds of views that they get from this are, you know, unhealthy in terms of, you know, sort of attitudes towards women and stuff, but they're unhealthy to them as well because they're going to further isolate them from, you know, other women, from mainstream society, and so on.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot that you said, a lot of great stuff. I'm in a group. It's not a women's group because they don't discriminate, but it's mostly women in the group. I think
Mm.
like it's maybe 25 plus, whatever. And there was a girl in the group who I think does like Andrew Tate. But it was like 1 out of 25. So the point I'm making is there are girls that do seem
Fair enough.
to maybe, and maybe because people say that you know, I don't know him or his stuff well enough, but people say that there's stuff that he talks about that's true, and people always they used to say that a lot. They try to misinterpret whatever, da, 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 and they don't see the whole picture. But his persona online has like it's been destroyed. I don't know from what, I don't know how, but it's already like people are like over him now. Which,
Yeah, I mean, he's a meme at this point, right?
yeah.
And I guess that's why it's always important to not get too kind of like focused on individuals, like influencers in this space, because it's constantly changing. Um, like, you know, like as a kind of side note or whatever. I mean, when I was doing the gaming research, you know, when I did sort of a paper looking at like PewDiePie, who was like this sort of massive gamer figure at the time.
Oh, I think.
Um, and of course, you know, sort of 7 years later or whatever, people are like, "Who the hell are you talking about?" And so, and I think with what we're talking about, always need to keep in mind that what we're talking about, you know, for better or worse, regardless of where you sit on this thing, we are seeing a very sort of significant sort of rise in reactionary and often kind of far right wing kind of views among a range of people, and especially among sort of men, and Andrew Tate might be the guy at the time. It's going to be someone different, but I think some of the kind of journalism around this, for example, gets too hung up on these individuals and like, oh, how can we stop the influence of Andrew Tate? And it's like, well, give it a year and we won't be talking about Andrew Tate. And as you say, I think we're kind of reaching that point now.
Yeah, we've reached that point. And yeah, I did just want to point out though, most of the women that I know are not fans, or people that I know, it's anecdotal, but are not
No,
fans
no.
of
Well, I mean,
Andrew
maybe
Tate.
these guys,
They,
maybe these guys just need to do their, I don't know, like check us. Maybe they need to put a setting on dating apps, like do you or do you not like Andrew Tate, and then it'll filter down to the dates that he might have a shot at.
listen, you might be able to make a good app. Marcus, come on.
Well, the
That's a
thing
good
is,
idea. That's a really good idea.
I think in your country, I don't know. I think it's just a states thing, but like I think there is an app for like kind of like ultra conservatives, like. But
It should be.
I can't. Yeah, I think there might be, but anyway, I
The
shouldn't be
conservatives
endorsing.
would deny Tate. They're not fans of Tate's a lot of Tate stuff either, though. I would say in America, like the traditional conservatives are not.
No, that's actually, it's good that you say that, because I want to just kind of make quite clear that I don't want to be sort of like seen as someone who's kind of like reductively against conservatism. I mean, I'm someone who's read, Edmund Burke, one of the sort of great, sort of like centuries old sort of founding philosophers of conservatism and stuff. And there are actually some good, important instincts in conservatism, in the sense of, to put it in lay terms, that sentiment of like, don't just let go of everything in the
Yeah.
past.
Yes.
That there,
Yeah.
that there's, that we inherit a whole complex range of cultural things. And if you
Yeah.
sort of just somehow have a Soviet revolution tomorrow, you stand to lose a lot. So, I mean, there are some good cautious instincts in
Oh
conservatism. And
yeah.
so,
Oh.
but I guess that's why I use the word reactionary. And again, just even keeping it in partial terms, when I say reactionary, what you're talking about is people who look at the society that we're in and go, I want to go back to a
So,
lost golden age.
gotcha.
And I think that kind of thinking, for a start, it's unrealistic. History, as Gore Vidal once said, history doesn't go backwards. So,
Yeah, and like you said, um, a lot of the manosphere space is a reaction to feminism and etc. But a lot of the problems, like you said, seems to be economically based. There seems to be it's going to be very hard as a guy to hold a very traditional masculine view of the world in today's world. Just
well,
just
it's going to be very,
practically, just to
yeah,
practically be able to have your wife stay at home. You're making all the money. Like it is just literally like in this economy. Go for it.
yeah,
And you're gonna
exactly.
constantly
No,
struggle. You're gonna struggle with the, you know, thinking like that. Like women should do this and stay at home, and then go. In America at least, go ahead and go make the living, and be able to have her stay at home the entire time. Okay, we'll see how
no, no,
that goes.
exactly. It is increasingly difficult, and especially for young people, to achieve those traditional conventional markers of success. And it's not their fault.
Exactly.
It's because, I mean, I teach a lot of undergraduate students who are deeply worried about what they're going to, and these are, higher educated. So they go to university. 20 years ago, that would have just been a ticket to a secure full-time employment. Nowadays, it's not, and so young people generally are just kind of deeply worried about their prospects, and through no fault of their own. And again, when you layer on that these kinds of pressures of kind of achieving kind of masculine ideals that are linked to those kinds of things, I mean, it's not surprising that then, someone sort of offers this kind of vision of, something to kind of rail against. I mean, this is a very loose analogy. I mean, it's always kind of a bit lazy to talk about Nazi Germany, but I mean, when you think of I mean, it isn't dissimilar when you look at the kind of, the absolute sort of catastrophic state of Germany at the end of the Weimar Republic. And then, Hitler and the Nazis came in, and in a very similar way, sort of offered this kind of very simple good and evil version of the
Yeah.
world, to sort of explain what was a kind of a complex kind of post World War One sort of issue. And yeah, no, and I mean, I don't want to get too reductive, but I think economic precarity, and the kind of failure of the political mainstream to actually meet the needs of people at a policy level for decades now, um, is is at the heart of a lot of kind of reactionary sort of backlashes, whether it's Trump, whether it's the Manosphere, or whatever.
Can I ask you, in your studies, have you found any like positive or good uh or decent role models in the manosphere, um that maybe they don't have an extremely rigid idea of masculinity, but it's like go to the gym, try to uh, be a better person, or have you found any people like that in the manosphere?
Well, I mean, again, it's this kind of like tricky thing to categorize. I mean, I've studied online male-centered communities that, at first glance, you would have thought were going to be these kind of reactionary, anti-feminist spaces, and then turned out not to be. So, one I did a paper recently on the subreddit, the Stoicism philosophy subreddit, which is a very kind of male dominated subreddit for these guys that, and they go there to try and make sense of their lives and kind of improve their situations and stuff by applying kind of quote unquote sort of stoic philosophical principles. And they read, they read some of the actual sort of ancient Greek stuff, but then there's a whole range of kind of like contemporary sort of stoic self-help literature and stuff like that. And when we went into it, we were expecting it to be a kind of a reactionary space. I didn't know much about this because there's this huge kind of upsurge of popularity of kind of Stoic philosophy, but Stoicism is also a kind of it's an ideal that's kind of usually associated with traditional forms of masculinity. The idea of sort of suppressing one's emotions, sucking it up, being a tough guy or whatever. So we went into this and we did a big sort of big data study of the discourses, on this subreddit, and it was actually it was sort of the opposite of what we
Ah,
expected, where it was actually this was a community of people a community of these guys who had emerged to offer a kind of an alternative to that kind of manosphere sort of reactionary thing. um, and yeah, the views there were quite complex and stuff. But there's a great study by surnames of the authors, Daly and Reed, and it's a study of incel subcultures where they actually interviewed incels. And even there, because incels are, generally seen, and I've looked at some of these forums, and they are often like this, quite sort of hateful, sort of hyper misogynistic, sort of violent rhetoric places. Um, but if you look carefully enough, you will even find diversity of thought in those incel cultures. So I mean, it's a tricky thing because there are these broader patterns. So there's a lot of these male-centered anti-feminist spaces, but when you look closely at what's going on in there, you will always find nuance and complexity. You'll find some guys that, aren't sort of fully signed up to that view. I mean, another study that I did was on 4chan, which is a kind of a famous old message board that's, still quite popular, and it's for a long time, it's been a breeding ground of kind of far right wing and reactionary kind of subcultures, including the manosphere, also the alt right before it. Um, and we looked at one of the message boards on there, and yeah, and found a lot of guys were coming into that space that were expressing those kinds of views, but it was in the process of being in those spaces that they kind of were, being kind of exposed to those views, and
gotcha.
for want of a better word, I guess, kind of radicalized or whatever. And radicalized is another word I'm not comfortable with because of the way that sort of links to kind of like arguments about terrorism and stuff like that. And again, I'm just sort of, I'm very kind of apprehensive about setting up my own kind of good versus evil thing, where it's like
Yeah.
good progressives and evil is or whatever.
Gotcha. Can you hear me, Marcus?
Yeah, yeah, that was just by the end of that bit. I think I think we're actually kind of doing some of the bits and some of the questions later and stuff, but whatever, we'll just see
Yeah,
how we go.
that's
But
fine. That's fine. I love it. I love it.
yeah,
You're answering. Okay. So then, I did just want to point out though, I did speak to a researcher who studies incels, and she said that incels, yeah, that like you said, it's more nuanced. With
yeah,
incels,
yeah.
that you have incels who may just like be lonely and think that they're worthless, but then you also have incels who then blame it on like I fully remember, but she did say like there was a difference. Like there was some incels that were like misogynistic, and then there were just incels who were just maybe more sexist, but not necessarily misogynistic. She said, but yeah, they're
No, no. I mean, just to quickly jump in there. Yeah, there's kind of, if we're looking at incels, there's kind of two kind of crucial components to understanding incels. All of them have one component, and then only, sort of some of them have both of the components. So the first one is that they all come together because they see themselves as abject failures. They're very isolated. They see themselves as having no prospects in the world of sort of, sexual and intimate relationships, often career as well. So that's the starting point. And then it's only but it must be said, it's a significant chunk, if not the majority, and it probably is the majority. It's then, the group that then blame, sort of progressive society and blame women for their predicament. But and that, it must be said that again, I'm hesitant to say most, but many, many, many incels have both of those components. But as you say, not all of them.
yeah. Yeah, gotcha. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about masculinity, just in a more specific way. So, you talk about hegemonic masculinity. You talk about fragile masculinity. What are those traits, or what what would you?
Theoretical ideas, we'll call them.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hegemonic masculinity is a big old famous sort of quote unquote theoretical framework, essentially, that it sort of helps us understand kind of how guys operate in the world and how they relate to women and so on. Um, and the basic idea of hegemonic masculinity is that in any given cultural context, whether it's the United States, whether it's like Australia, whether it's England, or in even a smaller context, whether it's like, a sporting community or whatever it is, there will be a set of ideals associated with the kind of like ideal masculinity. So, just a kind of a really basic sort of Western sense, the idea of that men must be strong, men must, sort of not show emotion, that kind of thing. Those are kind of masculine ideals. Um, and the framework, the hegemonic masculinity framework, hegemony meaning power, by the way, the hegemonic masculinity framework sort of helps us to understand how that set of masculine ideals, whatever they are, and they do change. So in certain Asian countries, the ideal man can be quite different to certain, sort of Western countries or whatever. But anyway, whatever the context is and whatever those masculine ideals are, they then work to set up a hierarchy which places individual men and different sort of types of sort of men and masculinity higher or lower on the thing. So a guy who sort of meets all of those kind of typical markers, and the reality is that no one ever does really, especially emotionally. That he'll be at the top, but then say a gay guy will be down the hierarchy because he doesn't meet those kind of markers of masculinity. Different in some contexts, there's a race component. So whatever the vision of the ideal man is, that then is set up to kind of like, and all men are kind of measured against that ideal, and those who don't fit into that ideal, will be kind of subordinated within that hierarchy. Again, often in terms of like class or race or sexuality, but not just those things. And then, of course, the other part of it is that that hierarchy also puts women in a particular subordinate position as well. And that, essentially whatever the ideal type of masculinity is, that is like the gold standard that everyone is sort of meant to kind of position themselves. But of course, it's not fair because not everyone, sort of like that. And I guess the analogy that I always think of is when I think about school, when I was at school and you had like kind of factions or whatever, and like you always had the jocks at the top, and then, like the geeks or the chess club or whatever it was were kind of subordinated. And of course, all of these people are all just perfectly legitimate, you know, people in who they are, but within, sort of social context, they're all sort of ordered in this hierarchy based on whatever the ideal is. Um, Sorry, and then the next thing you were talking about, which is another kind of theoretical idea that I've borrowed and sort of used, is this idea of fragile masculinity. Sometimes in social psychology literature, it's called precarious
Yeah.
manhood. Um, and that's an idea that relates to this. And it's the idea that men, and this is kind of links back to what we were talking about earlier, but when men fail to meet those ideals we just talked about, or their sort of identity in relation to those ideals is threatened in some way, um, then they feel a particular pain and they can sort of lash out against, sort of, or just sort of lash out generally in that sense. So again, when a guy loses his job, it puts him in a kind of a position of precarious manhood because it's not just the economic loss of that job. It's a sort of an injury to himself as someone who's trying to achieve whatever the masculine ideals are. Um, and there are some great studies that actually show a link between feeling threatened about one's masculinity and the adoption of right-wing views.
Uh,
And these are psych studies rather than sociology studies. But a man who has his manhood threatened is more likely to find Andrew Tate appealing, or more likely to find Trump appealing.
gotcha. So it's basically like this gold standard of manhood, which I don't know. I guess I could see that, because women have their gold standard of femininity, so then guys have this kind of gold standard of masculinity, and basically precarious manhood is this idea of that being you being in a precarious masculine state, which they I guess wouldn't you constantly be in a precarious masculine state because depending on what the ideals are. So if the ideal is like, financial, being financially superior, or, making a lot of money, that can always not happen. You could always lose that job, like you said, or you can always, you know what I mean? Or if you're the strongest guy, you can just the next day not be the strongest guy. You know what I mean? It's like, aren't you kind of always in this like almost
Yeah,
this
yeah.
state fluid?
No, that's a really kind of good question, actually, because I mean, if I'm just thinking about me right now, so I mean, all men live in a situation where they are, or we are not achieving as you would say, the gold standard of masculinity. Um, and so, in a sense, we're kind of all potentially on this spectrum of kind of fragile masculinity. And I guess this is where, uh, the point is, like any kind of, like anything, whether it's kind of like consuming drugs or like, or, whatever it is, like there's so many different examples you could use. The point is that, the question is, at what point does it become damaging to a person? At what point does, um, you know, not to get too medicalized or whatever, but at what point does it become pathological? So, and that's when, and again, this relates to this manosphere stuff, but, so yeah, maybe, I'm not like necessarily the best looking guy. I'm not necessarily the kind of the best athlete or whatever it is. I don't have like $1 million paying job or whatever. So the question is then, what is my kind of like outlook on life? And, and do I have a kind of healthy, realistic relationship to the world that means that, you know, I'm okay with that. You know what I mean? So, I guess fragile masculinity or precarious manhood is that point at which the person becomes so not okay with, with that situation, that it then does have a kind of an effect, a kind of a negative effect on how they view themselves and how they kind of interact with the world. Um, and that, the manosphere is exactly that. It's sort of like it's this thing that has emerged because the reality of men's lives is so out of whack with this kind of like this traditional ideal type of manhood. Um, and so there's only two ways you can deal with that, at least as an individual.
Is it mine or is it Mark? Yeah, yeah. You were saying that there's basically only two ways you can deal with um what's going on with the traditional masculine ideals and um what's going on with people feeling fragile. And you were saying, like, from my perspective, there's really kind of only two ways you can deal with that, right? Or so.
Yeah, yeah. So, when one's inability to kind of achieve a set of kind of markers in life, when one is unable to, there's you either live in the state where you kind of are going to eventually kind of lash out about that, or you try and find some sort of way to kind of live in the world as it is. And the precarious manhood stuff is not just a social science thing. I mean, it informs kind of clinical practice with men and trying to help them to kind of work through their issues. So, but as you said, I think at the start, I think we all live in a state where where there's a certain ideal life that we're meant to sort of strive for, that that we can't achieve, or most people can't achieve.
Yeah.
And yeah, where it gets important to look at is when a person finds it increasingly difficult to kind of come to terms with that, and you find that in this kind of um, in terms of sort of men and how they see themselves as men.
You also talk about like a retreater. You mentioned that collapsed masculinity and a retreater. Is it kind of the same thing?
No, actually, so the idea of a collapsed masculinity, or the idea of the retreater, the person who was kind of retreating, actually relates to what we were talking about earlier about there being two parts of being an incel.
Oh.
Um, and so the collapsed masculinity idea tries to make sense of that first part, that you have this increasing phenomenon of these kind of isolated guys who are just failing to kind of achieve the kind of standards of masculinity, and then have just kind of given up trying and have just said, you know what, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for me. But that group haven't necessarily then got to that point of sort of blaming women and blaming feminism. Um, and so, as the other person you spoke to about this sort of said, there are these two parts of incels. The idea of the collapse of collapsed masculinity, and the idea of the retreater, the person who's kind of retreated, the man who's kind of retreated from trying to achieve those kind of markers of success, is sort of a similar thing, trying to make sense of that. Um, there's a subgroup in the manosphere called men going their own way, which is sort of similar, but again, even that men going their own way group, which is just guys who are sort of like, you know what, I'm just going to be a sort of lone wolf or whatever. That group do also generally tend to kind of hold kind of anti sort of feminist and misogynistic views often.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So you did do two studies and we did touch on them. So, but you did one on, you've done many studies, but you've done a study on 4chan for relating to the manosphere. And you talked about earlier why it was relevant. It's basically a space where at a certain point it was like more popular than a lot of spaces we know right now. It seems like it was like the beginning of where you started seeing like guys getting together and kind of talking about different problems. And some people were just on there to be on there and went a certain way, and all that stuff. So that you chose 4chan for the study because of the fact that it was just the best place at the time, I guess, right? One of the most relevant spaces.
Yeah, we chose 4chan to study because, I mean, in sort of most basic terms, it has for a long time been a breeding ground of reactionary subcultures, including the Manosphere. Um, and to give it just a sense of what 4chan is for anyone listening, which is that 4chan's quite unique. It's been around for sort of since the beginning of the internet, and it's still, it's still got a lot of traffic. Um, but the key components of 4chan is that it's anonymous by design, so you don't have users. Everyone is on it is anonymous, and also the content on there is what you would call ephemeral. So it only stays up for a certain amount of time before then just disappearing into the ether. And so those two components, the anonymity of the space and the fact that content never stays up very long, very much encourage the craziest kind of stuff you can imagine, and almost like the kind of like collective id of society just kind of running rampant. So it's unsurprisingly, it's been a kind of breeding ground for a lot of a lot of views and subcultures and so on, that wouldn't be seen as okay, in sort of mainstream kind of, normal society. And a person would hold these views and they wouldn't necessarily want to have their name associated with them on Facebook or whatever. But that over time is sort of changing. I mean, the mainstream internet is becoming a place where a lot of quite sort of full on views are now sort of acceptable. Facebook being an example of that. But yeah, no, we studied 4chan as a well known breeding ground of kind of male centered reactionary sort of subculture.
Gotcha. And with the studying, what were you guys looking for? What were you guys trying? You guys are just trying to see how they think about um society, or what were you guys looking for with the study?
Well, um, so I mean, I think there was a New York Times article a few years ago that referred to 4chan as the most quote unquote toxic place on the internet. And like going right back to what we were saying at the beginning or whatever, I've always been interested in actually doing a kind of a deep dive into these spaces to see what's actually going on, because the reality of these kinds of cultures is almost always much more complex than you know just this idea of them being sort of terminally toxic and nasty spaces. Um, and so and in terms of what we're looking for, I mean, in simplest terms, it was just that. It was like, okay, so this is supposedly a toxic, nasty, hateful, reactionary space, and yet no one's actually done that much in depth analytical research on this space that everyone seems to know. Everyone seems to think they know what it is. You know what I mean? So in simplest terms, that was the inquiry. We looked at a particular message board, which was the advice message board. Again, because I do have that interest in how sort of young people, and especially sort of boys and young men, are kind of try and make sense of their lives and talk and communicate with each other about that stuff. Um, so, I mean, that message board was particularly interesting because it's like, okay, so what does an advice board look like on this supposedly most toxic space on the internet? Um, and it was interesting because, there was a lot of actually really supportive, kind of poignant, kind of, actually kind of useful, nice advice being shared between these kind of these young men who are going through a lot of like serious problems. But of course, in that mix, you also had the kind of indoctrination stuff. Sort of you had the kind of manosphere kind of users who would kind of try and quote unquote help the guy by saying, "Oh, well, you do realize you're just the victim of a society that's geared against us men and all that sort of stuff." Um, and I guess, the dynamic that we found the most interesting was, yeah, thinking of thinking of 4chan as a breeding ground for for these kinds of cultures. What you're seeing is you are seeing a lot of young guys who are entering into these spaces who don't necessarily hold these kinds of reactionary views. Um, and then they sort of start living in these spaces, and it's over a certain amount of time that they then meet others, and sort of start, some of them will then kind of adopt these kinds of sort of let's say unhelpful worldviews, or whatever. But yeah, as I said, having looked in depth at a large data set of this stuff, there was also, you know, kind of nice, supportive kind of advice being given. So, I mean, 4chan's a really complex place, but as I said about the study of looking at sort of incel forums, other incel forums, the reality of these things is always much more complicated, and contradictory, and whatever, when you actually do kind of close analysis of that stuff. And that's an easy thing to say, but it's a really important thing to say, because I think, especially because of how divided, sort of whether it's American society or British society is, everyone seems to think that they've kind of characterized everyone else. So, the conservatives, sort of see all the progressives as these kind of like cartoonish woke morons, and the progressives all see the conservatives as all this one amorphous group of nasty, evil people.
Yeah.
And it's just the world is not like that. And I think part of the problem is that we are sort of moving into these, we have moved into these camps that sees the world in these very simplistic, good versus evil, you versus me terms.
Types of way. So basically with 4chan, you saw a lot of toxicity, but you also saw people trying to help each other. And
Yeah.
what was interesting is some people were then like trying to get into they were influencing. Sometimes you have people who are just on there genuinely for help and get influenced. But you also did another study that looked in, like you said earlier, philosophies and Stoicism. And what was that on the same? Where'd you look for that study? What channel did you
No,
look?
that was a subreddit on Reddit, really big, one of the sort of very popular subreddits, and it was a philosophy subreddit, Stoic philosophy subreddit. Mostly, and the moderators confirmed this. It's most of their traffic is from sort of men, and from our sort of analysis of the data, lots of sort of young men going into this space to try and make sense of their lives and sort of talk about their problems in relation to this specific Stoic philosophy framework, which again is, when we start to research it, I was just surprised by how, what a big popular phenomenon this is. There's all these kind of, I can't remember the names of the authors, but there's a couple of these really big sort of best-selling sort of contemporary or modern Stoic advice type authors or whatever. But, and a subreddit like that, a colleague had sort of said, "Oh, you should check this out if you're into that Manosphere stuff. It's probably likely to be interesting." There's a lot of these male-centered communities, I think, that people at first glance will assume are kind of reactionary or quote unquote toxic spaces, and actually they're not. I mean, the most interesting thing, as I sort of mentioning earlier, the most interesting thing about that big Stoic, male-centered Stoic philosophy subreddit was that the moderators and many of the people on there actually positioned that community as a kind of an antidote to the manosphere. So they were saying, don't get sucked into that red pill stuff. Here's a more healthy, realistic way of viewing the world. And so what ended up becoming interesting to me and my co-authors on that study was more the way that what we were seeing in terms of that quote unquote antidote to the manosphere, trying to have healthy relationships with oneself and women and so on. It was actually very close to a lot of these kinds of kind of mainstream kind of youth sector kind of kind of responses to kind of the rise of reactionary movements, which is to say, I think not particularly effective at countering something like the manosphere. And as we say in the paper, I think the problem with a lot of these counter narratives or antidotes to the manosphere and antidotes to right wing, to the kind of resurgence of kind of reactionary views and so on, is that they sort of do not take into account the kind of socioeconomic anxieties that sit at the heart of this stuff. So whether it's the Stoic philosophy subreddit or whether it's, some, kind of commentator on TV, there's a lot of this kind of narrative of like, guys, you just need to shed your toxic views and kind of be more healthy in your attitudes towards women and so on. And it's much easier said than done to get an incel and just tell them to somehow be better people, because these people, all of us, are products of the environment that we're in. And until you kind of change that environment, or at least kind of take into account that the environment is important, that you're not going to change. So, I mean, in simplest terms, looking at incels, for example, it's no good saying to an incel, stop hating women and try to be more healthy about how you view the world or whatever, because they're still going to be isolated. And it's the isolation that is at the key of this. So when you start to think about, okay, so if isolation is the cause, or a big driver of something like incel culture, then obviously the answer to trying to improve that is to, try and improve the isolation. But of course, that's a big thing, because we're talking about a society which is totally increasingly fracturing and
Yeah.
isolating people from each other. So, I mean, these small subcultures and these problems all ultimately relate to, this big thing of the society. Oh God, it sounds cliche, but the society that we live in. And yeah.
Sounds cliche, but it's true. You know what's interesting? The researcher that I spoke to about incel culture, she said that a lot of them, I won't say a lot, I don't want to, but she said people leave out of it when they start start having more interactions. They
Exactly.
immediately almost
No, that's
realize, like,
exactly it.
yeah, the advice I was getting here was kind of stupid. It's not, it doesn't line up with reality. She said a lot. She said they will leave. Like there's people that will leave based off of doing this,
When
interacting with people more.
exactly, when people's circumstances change, their views change. And so it's all about those circumstances. I mean, that's so absolutely sort of on the money. And I think we're forgetting that, a lot of these kinds of programs or like antidotes or counter narratives are just totally missing that. And I mean, I remember like when I was younger, I was like really into conspiracy theory. This is like way back in the day, like in some ways kind of pre-internet culture, or like early internet culture or whatever. Um, but I was also kind of studying and stuff, and I was a little bit kind of isolated or whatever. And yeah, just when I got a job and when I was a bit more integrated in society or whatever, my views kind of our views naturally change, depending on that context. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, the integration. When you integrate,
Exactly.
we got the Marcus today and the nice jacket.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is, and I turned out well in the end.
You
It all
did.
worked out.
So Marcus, well, you kind of said how we can help these guys. Is there anything uniquely that for like, let's say, I don't know if you have kids, if you have a hypothetical son, how you would try to, maybe, I don't know, would you try to protect them from these spaces, or how would you think about that for your kids?
Oh,
Um,
well, I mean, yeah, okay. I don't have kids, so and my views on this would probably be a lot less libertarian if I did have kids. Um, but I'm not a fan of like heavily policing the internet, because the way that I see it is that you know the internet is sort of a reflection of what's actually going on. I mean, there's a great concept by an American media scholar called Milton Muller, and it's a bit of a clunky phrase or whatever, but it's hyper transparency. But basically, what that idea is that, so there's a lot of kind of like, well, it's an antidote, if you will, to this idea. So you have this idea that the internet is kind of causing all these problems. Um,
yeah.
and it's a view that largely I reject in terms of the kinds of stuff that we're looking at. The internet is definitely the space in which these things are playing out, but it's, 4chan or toxic in online cultures or whatever did not cause the manosphere. They did not cause QAnon or whatever. These are the spaces where these things are playing out. The concept of hyper transparency is really useful, because instead of seeing the internet as the cause of problems, the internet is, I mean, I think it's really helpful to see the internet as a space that has rendered hyper transparent or very
Um,
transparent those problems that are there in society. So we can no longer hide for them, because people have that forum for kind of expressing, whatever they are. And so in a sense, the internet is as good a thing as it is as bad a thing, and it's just a tool. I mean, I don't want to overstate this case because I think, there is an extent to which kind of problems can kind of fester and maybe intensify
Yeah.
online. But there's way too much focus on, thinking we can solve these, what are ultimately social issues, by kind of shutting down discourse on the internet. But if I had kids, I'd probably be a lot more open to the idea of shutting down 4chan. But that's the difference between a parent and an academic. And I mean, not that long ago, the end of last year, Australia actually banned everyone 16 years and under from social media platforms. And and they did it on the basis of mental health.
Yeah.
There's a famous, oh God, what's his name, psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote this book, completely ungrounded in evidence, but basically, he did one of those sort of cause and effect fallacy things where, you have the rise of the internet, you have the rise of mental health problems, and Jonathan Haidt, you know, very famous, makes a lot of money, just goes, well, one caused the other. And you know, mental health issues, and the rise of things like anxiety and depression are very complex phenomena, particularly amongst young people. And one thing we do know that they relate to is the kind of precarity, socioeconomic precarity, that a lot of young people face today. Um, it's a very seductive kind of simple answer to go, well, no, it's the internet has caused this problem. But you have an entire country that's now banned young people from mainstream social media platforms on the basis of this fallacy that if we just shut off the internet, everything will be okay. And it won't help the problem. If anyone ever finds this in 10 years' time, I'm very confident that I'll be proven right there. But it allows people to kind of stay blind to what's really sort of going on with these things as well. Sorry, I think I drifted a bit from your
No,
question,
no, no,
mate.
no, no. That was great, Marcus. I have not stayed up on Jonathan Haidt's
Hate, yeah, yeah.
Haidt,
Sorry,
yeah. No,
I'm
I don't
sorry.
know.
Apologies to him if hate is.
Yeah.
I
If I
didn't.
said,
I didn't. That wasn't a Freudian slip or anything. But
yeah, if I said it wrong. But
no,
I
I think it
know,
might be
like,
high.
as Hyde, right? About, maybe it's been like 6 years, 7 years since he's like written that book. And I remember at the time it intuitively felt correct. It was like, well,
Yeah,
intuitively it felt correct. But I haven't like so I don't really know, but I've heard that there's a lot of people who've poked holes um in the research and stuff like that. So I don't, and because have you looked at it? That's kind of what
yeah.
happened?
I mean, I've looked at that, but I've looked. I mean, his work in that area is part of a long line of what you could sort of see as kind of moral panic inducing, quote unquote, scholarship.
And
It's
Marcus,
very
let's just give the audience what his work is, because I forgot. There's probably a lot of people who don't even know what we're talking
Christ, I
about.
can't remember. I'll have to Google it quickly. I mean, what is the name of
Well,
the
let
famous
me just
book?
say that in general, he's hinting that that we've gotten, I think, I remember his work being overprotective of youth. And
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, yeah. So I mean,
you guys have
he's
to
done
look
a
it up, I
number of
guess.
no, no, he's done it. Jonathan Haidt's done a number of things. One is the argument of this sort of like uh, cotton balling of kids, or like over coddling of kids. That's kind of a separate well, these are two related things, but I guess I'm more interested in the internet one for what we're talking about. But that's a debatable thing. I mean, I was a kid in like the 90s, and it's certainly true that, like, life was like a completely dangerous nightmare back
Yes.
then in ways that there wasn't. And I'm not sure it's necessarily an entirely good thing that we've become so sort of safety oriented. So
No.
we'll just park that part of his argument to the side. But more recently, he's had a very sort of kind of confident, and I would say confidently incorrect argument that social media is to blame for the rise in mental health issues among young people. And it's an argument essentially based on two graphs.
Oh,
And, but as I say, it's not just him, that I don't know if, you might be a bit too young to remember this, but in the 90s, there was this big thing around video games and how they how they cause violence.
I was at the
Um,
tail end of that. Yeah. So
yeah. So like the early Grand Theft Autos
yeah, I
and
love
that
that
sort of
game.
stuff. Yeah. So masterpiece, absolute masterpiece game,
Masterpiece.
and kind of interesting reflections of society. But anyway, but back then, sort of mid to late 90s, you had this argument that was again very seductive for politicians and kind of cultural commentators. And you just hit the nail on the head. It sort of it intuitively made sense to kind of ordinary people watching TV and so on. And the argument was there's this rise of violent video games, and then we have this kind of rise in gun violence and mass shootings. This is in America, obviously. So it makes sense that the two things are related. And of course, the big one was the Columbine High School massacre in like whatever it was, like 90 something or whatever. And the fact that those two guys that went into that school were big Doom players. They played the original version of Doom, which is a first person shooter. Um, so there was this huge kind of, again, and this is using a sociological concept, moral panic around video games as being like deeply dangerous to young people. The interesting thing was, and I've read a lot of this stuff because I did a lot of gaming research. There were piles and piles and piles of psychological papers purporting to prove the link between video games and violence in the real world. Like you would have these like lab type studies where they would measure the kind of emotional responses of these young men as they sort of, were shooting people in the game, and they would then extrapolate that to say, well, this proves that it makes them angry and blah, 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 all this stuff. And it is all garbage. It was all garbage. And, I just don't, it doesn't bear thinking the millions and millions of dollars that would have gone into funding that garbage research. And when we look back in 20 years' time at now, we will say the same thing about social media and mental health. And part of the analogy that's also important there is that in the American context, one of the reasons that was such a seductive thing, video games cause violence in the real world, is because it allowed people to not have to deal with the gun rights issue and the issue of regulation of, gun regulation or whatever, regardless of where you stand on that issue. It's a sort of side point, but there's a real world American context that needs to be grappled with in terms of gun violence, and video games offer a very simple way of trying to kind of like solve that riddle. In exactly the same way that social media offers a very simple way of trying to solve the riddle of, why young people are so sort of, again, sorry to use the word, precarious, in such kind of precarious states of mental well-being right now. And it's a much more seductive kind of simple way of looking at it than actually trying to think about some of those socioeconomic issues that we've been looking at.
yeah, and like you hinted at before, it can be the video game stuff could have been isolation. I wonder if those guys had jobs. I wonder if they were engaged in the
Absolutely.
community. Yeah,
No, and in fact, in that Columbine case, just as an example of that, you're absolutely right. Often, in terms of causation or whatever, often two things are the product of something else. So, yes, these guys were playing a lot of video games, and yes, these guys went out and shot people. But those two things were actually a product of their isolation and their the mental health issues. But yes, sorry, yeah, no. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head in these cases, and I think social media is the same. I mean, social media in a sense has kind of emerged as something, to sort of help people with that isolation and with that those mental health issues. Or at least, it's emerged in a very fractured and isolated world. It hasn't created that fractured and isolated world.
right, right. I do wonder if there's like a certain level of if you're, I don't know, this stuff is hard. It's really hard. Like if you're on social media, because if social media is taking the place of like real world interactions, then maybe can help with certain, it can
It
cause,
can exacerbate certain things.
yeah, it can
Yeah. No,
exacerbate
I
certain
mean,
things.
yeah, I mean, it's sort of like any. I mean, it's yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. There's a point at which any activity becomes kind of pathological. Like
Yeah,
whether it's alcohol or social media or shopping or eating or whatever. But as any psychiatrist will tell you, the person who takes a certain practice to pathological levels usually has an underlying
that's true.
um, reason for doing that, whether it's a social context or whether it's a psychological context or whatever. So addiction, despite what what some, I mean, I've forgotten what the American dictionary of categories are or whatever, but because there's a number of different ones. But addiction is not an illness; it's the symptom of an illness, or it's the symptom of a particular context. So unemployed people are more likely to overconsume drugs. People with mental
Yeah,
health issues are more likely to overconsume drugs. And in just the same way, if there's someone who's got a porn addiction, for example, or who has a social media addiction, there's something underlying that, and these are essentially kind of self-medication strategies, and obviously sort of unhealthy ones.
I love that. So, in a nutshell, let's not ban social media. This is what I'm getting from you. Um, Try to integrate, another tip that I'm getting from you that I might use, is try to integrate yourself out more into society. Because, like, with me doing this, definitely trying to be intentional about, looking for maybe ways that you can talk to people and, create communities, or being around communities and stuff like that is a positive. Would you suggest anything else? The guy just spoke to a guy about men's groups for guys, um, who maybe
Yeah,
that's,
we need. I mean, that's the thing. As a society, as societies, because you're sort of technically in a different one to my one right now, but as a society, we need to be fostering and creating, avenues for that stuff. Um, And it's got nothing to do with the internet. I mean, in some ways, the internet does. I mean, especially if you ask like a, sort of LGBTQI kid or whatever, what does the internet bring to their lives? Especially if ones who live in maybe kind of like a country, really conservative community or whatever. The internet is like saving grace for a lot of these kids because they can find other people like them or whatever. But yeah, since the 1980s onwards, you know, we've become less, as society, we have not offered people ways of coming together and integrating. And we've all gone into our own little bubbles and so on. So, I mean, I know we're sort of coming to an end here, and it's, in some ways, it's such a frustratingly big, difficult thing. But, I mean, if, for example, the next election, the Democrats, you know, want to actually win, they need to offer some sort of substantial policy change to society that relates to kind of people's welfare and economic welfare. Um, Sorry, I've got I mean, it's such a like how do we solve this problem is goes to the very heart of how our societies has been organized in very kind of individualized ways for decades at this point.
yeah, for decades at this point. No, 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 no. I love it, Marcus. Where can people find you?
Oh God, at the moment, I mean, I'm still on Twitter or X.
I love it. I gotta follow you on Twitter.
Yeah, no, well, kind of. I mean, that whole thing. That's at Marcus J Maloney, capital M for Marcus, capital J the letter, and then Maloney, capital Maloney. And then I'm on LinkedIn. I can't remember what the username is, but LinkedIn is such a cringe corporate hellscape, so don't worry about that. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, or I mean, if you Google me, you'll find my sort of uni staff profile. So I welcome all the hate and the trolling from
I don't think
whatever.
you're gonna. I think you might get people might actually reach out to you, like, you know, because yeah, because you said a lot of great things. And
No, no, this I enjoyed this chat. I think our second run of it was actually probably a bit
better.
cooler than the
Yeah,
first one.
I
Yeah,
liked I liked it. And to your point, because I've been doing a lot of internet interviews, and we've been going in on the internet. We've been bashing the internet.
Right. As the cause of these things,
Yeah,
yeah.
not necessarily cause, but like I haven't spoken to anyone who's believed that it's been the cause, but there have been, just like any tool, there have been like certain personality traits that um go into certain spaces, and they can use whatever. They can use the internet, they use religion, they use whatever they can, and they dominate the narratives. And I found out so many interesting things, like narcissist types are really big in certain Reddit spaces around nofap, and
Yeah.
the researchers was talking about that. And then I've had a lot of people talk about some of the dangers of the internet, but I'm just happy that you also point out some of the very positive things of the internet, because honestly, even thinking about me, and like you said, the word radicalized is weird. It's like associated with terrorism, but I could have easily went down a very extreme path, not even just using the
Same.
internet.
Same. Same.
Yeah, just listening to the radio of the area that
Yeah.
I was.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's like you had the kind of racist riots here in the UK last year, and you had all the politicians going like, "Oh, bloody, social media, we need to shut it down and stuff." And it's like, Jesus Christ, have you watched kind of mainstream right wing news over the last sort of 5 years? They are the ones who've been stoking this shit.
It's true. And what I was going to say was, what saved me was intellectuals just getting on the internet. And I heard some intellectuals, and I was like, oh shit, thank God, or whatever. Cause I would have, who knows? Like, if I didn't have some reasonable people online to find, and them kind of talk about the conversation in a more nuanced way, I would have been out. I would have, I don't know. so, so yeah, thank you so
You,
much, Marcus.
no, you should. That's a lovely way to end this, and you should don't cut out what you just did then, because I think that just is a really nice way to end it. So.
Well, thank you so much, and I'll be watching your work, and I gotta get a Twitter account up. You'll probably be like the first person I follow or something.
No, well, that's fine, but I think you'll be joining at the time when everyone's leaving. But anyway,
Are you going to Blue Sky, Marcus?
yeah, probably. I don't know. I can't.